You're listening to the podcast of The Branch in Ashland, Virginia. We're all searching for hope. Where do we find it? As we enter into the Advent season, we start out looking at hope, where we find it, and what we do with it once it's found.
I've found myself most of you know that I'm a pretty big reader, and I've found myself gravitating towards all kinds of books. Sometimes I find myself reading too heady books, and I need to kind of cleanse the palate a little bit and find something a little bit simpler. So I've discovered the young adult genre of books, and there's a book series called the City of Ember books, and I read the first of the series a few weeks ago, and as I was reading it, as I was preparing for this Advent season, I was just seeing these parallels and these connections between this city that was underground in darkness and the way that the world is really without Jesus, and how Jesus comes into the world and he's the light of the world, as the Gospel of John says. And so I went back to the book and I read it, and I thought, oh, wow, these first couple of paragraphs, they really kind of hit me in a different light in terms of Advent. And this is how the book opens. It says, in the city of Ember, the sky was always dark. The only light came from great flood lamps mounted on the buildings and on the tops of poles in the middle of the larger squares. When the lights were on, they cast a yellowish glow over the streets, people walking by through long shadows that shortened and then stretched out again. When the lights were off, as they were between 9 at night and 6 in the morning, the city was so dark, people might as well have been wearing blindfolds. Sometimes darkness fell in the middle of the day. The city of Ember was old, and everything in it, including the power lines, was in need of repair. And so now and then the lights would flicker and go out, and these were terrible moments for the people of Ember. As they came to a halt in the middle of the street or stood stock still in their houses, afraid to move in the utter blackness, they were reminded of something they preferred not to think about, that someday the lights of the city might go out and never come back on. Despite the darkness that's in this city, you read through the story, and the main character, little Lena, she has this hope, and she always has these dreams about this other world, and she wakes up from her dreams and she starts painting them or drawing them out. And she's confident, she's got hope that there's something beyond this city of Ember. She's got hope that somewhere else there's a city where the light isn't going to go out, where they're not going to be overcome by darkness. And I wonder if you've ever been in a place in life that's kind of like described here in this book, that place where it seems like the darkness had overcome, that you were ready, it might as well have blindfolds on because it felt so dark to you. And you just wondered if there was any hope beyond it. Have you been overwhelmed to that point that you've been afraid that one day the lights are going to go out and they're not going to come back on? It seems like over these last few years that it's felt dark in a lot of ways. COVID, politics, war, shootings, the economy. We could go on and on about so many things that have the potential for casting darkness on our lives. And I wonder, in the midst of that darkness that can sometimes consume us and overwhelm us, where is it that we find hope? What do we look forward to with expectation and anticipation? This season of Advent that kicks off today is all about anticipation and expectation, the waiting of the coming of Jesus. God's people, they walked in darkness for a long time, for hundreds and hundreds of years. In fact, the prophet Isaiah, who we read about earlier, he wrote this in Isaiah 9:2. He said, "The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned." If we go back to Scripture and we read both in the Old Testament in Hebrew and then the New Testament in Greek, there are different words that the authors use for hope. Yachal means to wait or to hope or expect. And it occurs 19 times in the Psalms, 8 times in Job. And if we read through the Psalms, if we read through the book of Job, we can see the need for hope. If you remember the story of Job, who lost everything, if ever there was a time that somebody needed hope, it was at that point. Another Hebrew word for hope is tikvah, and it's again described as expectation or hope. And we see this occur 12 times in the book of Job. And then Paul in the New Testament, as he's writing to the Roman Christians who were kind of going against culture and society and were paying the price for doing that, he wrote in Romans 8:22 through 25, we know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. Not only so, but we ourselves who have the first fruits of the Spirit groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption, the sonship, the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we are saved, but hope that is seen is no hope at all. Who hopes for what they already have? But if we hope for what we do not yet have, we wait for it patiently. And here Paul uses the Greek word elpis, which also means hope or anticipation, expectation. Earlier in this chapter of Romans, Paul uses a word that it literally means to crane one's neck. And the way I've always described it is I think about road trips that I went on as a kid and how my dad would always say, my brother and I would be in the back seat and we'd say, when are we going to get there? My dad would inevitably say, it's just around the bend. And so we'd be kind of craning our necks to see if he was like serious or not. Usually he wasn't. That just meant, shut up kids, I'm driving, right? So, but what Paul says here, and the word that Paul uses about the hope and expectation of what is coming, that all of creation is eagerly waiting and craning their necks, wondering when that hope is actually going to emerge and show itself. Theologian and pastor and author N.T. Wright wrote a great book called Surprised by Hope. And in that book, he says a lot of great things about this idea of hope and where we put it. And here's one of his quotes. He says this: the ultimate future hope remains a surprise, partly because we don't know when it will arrive, partly because at present we have only images and metaphors for it, leaving us to guess that the reality will be far greater and more surprising still. And the intermediate hope, the things that happen in the present time, are always surprising because left to ourselves, we lapse into a kind of collusion with entropy, acquiescing in the general belief that things may be getting worse, but there's nothing much we can do about them. And I wonder, I've been amazed sometimes, even talking to believers, people who profess faith in Jesus Christ, how N.T. Wright's so right here that instead of having a hope like Paul talks about, instead of waiting with expectation and anticipation, we're instead colluding with entropy. I love that phrase, probably as a recovering engineer, that this idea that everything is not moving from chaos to order, but things are moving from order to chaos. And he says that some of us just sit back and let it happen and wait. Instead of expecting something greater to happen, we all need hope. And we're all looking for something. We're craning our necks, looking around the corner to see what's going to happen. In a few weeks, those of us who have kids or grandkids or nephews, nieces, others will see what happens on Christmas morning with that same hope and expectation and anticipation. As kids are waiting to see what's waiting. And hey, if some of us might be doing the same thing as adults, waiting to see what's under that tree on Christmas morning. What did Santa bring us? What are we going to find there? Are we hoping and expecting something great there? You see, hope is always something that we're waiting for. It's waiting for something that isn't quite here yet. It's waiting for something that we have confidence is coming, but we don't know when, we don't know where, and we just keep waiting for it to happen. It's the anticipation for something that hasn't been yet realized. Hope is always waiting for something else to come along to bring it to its final fulfillment. And that's what this season of the year is about. It's about the hope and expectation that God's people had for so long. They'd gone through these periods of bondage and these periods of exile. And finally, they heard from the prophets that somebody would come and fulfill this hope that was deeply rooted in them all. And the people of God, they realized something important that we need to realize as well. That our hope has to be grounded in the promises of God. In order for hope to really be fulfilled, we need to put it in the promises of God. We don't hope for something that we already have. Paul says that in Romans 8. We hope for what we don't have yet, for something that hasn't quite come to us yet. There's mystery there. There's surprise there because we don't have all the knowledge of that and what it's based on, but we do have the promises of God. We do have what he's told us, and our hope must be grounded in those promises, the promises of God. God had promised that his throne would carry on and would be eternal. And just like we sang about that lineage of Jesus through David the king, the people of God knew, because of the promises that God had made to David, that a king would come. If we look over in 2 Samuel chapter 7, the second half of verse 11 through 16, this is what we read. The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. And he's speaking to David here, and he says, when your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I'll raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I'll establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name. I'll establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I'll be his father, he will be my son. When he does wrong, I'll punish him in a rod wielded by men, with floggings inflicted by human hands, but my love will never be taken away from him as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. God had made promises to his people. We go all the way back to the beginning in Genesis. God made promises to Abraham. Even though Abraham and Sarah were old, beyond childbearing years, God said, there's going to be a line that's going to start with you. And they believed God's promise. They put hope in the promise that God had given them. And then years later, when Saul was king and was doing a horrible job, God actually called David and said, you're the future king, and your throne will be forever. He didn't mean literally that David was going to be on that throne, but David's line would come and would fulfill the promises of God. And the people of God, they knew his promises. But here's the thing about promises. The longer that we have to wait for promises to be fulfilled, the less hope that we have in them. Has that ever happened to you before? Someone promises you something, and you're like, okay, like that promise is still, the words are still hanging in the air, and you're like, okay, yeah. And then days go by, and weeks go by, and months go by, and that promise hasn't been fulfilled. You wonder, the people of God, as they had heard and read and studied the promises of God, and then years went by, hundreds of years, and they had probably given up hope. And I think many of us, like N.T. Wright says, that we've felt like, well, there's nothing we can do to stave off the inevitable. The inevitability of entropy has gotten us down into the darkness. But we can't let ourselves get there if we've put our hope in the promises of God. What promises have you heard before that you've begun to lose hope about? Has someone promised you something in life? Maybe you thought your life would look way different than it does now. Maybe there's a relationship that's been broken. Here we just went through Thanksgiving, and it's interesting to have conversations with people leading up to and then after the fact to see if there's anxiety or there's good anticipation about what's going to happen. And I wonder how many of us are still looking for hope and expecting something to come along. We all need hope, and many of us have lost hope more than once in life. We felt like somebody's let us down. Maybe even God. Maybe we feel like He's let us down. In the midst of that darkness, Isaiah wrote, and Jesus fulfilled that years later. The one for whom they had waited had finally come, and I love the way that John in his gospel opens things up in John 1. And just like the city of Ember, this city in darkness, John speaks to that. In John 1:5, he writes this, "The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." Have you ever gone into a pitch black room and lit a candle or turned on a flashlight? Just a tiny bit of light will actually pierce through the darkness. And that's what John wrote about. He knew that who he had met and experienced in Jesus was the one who was bringing light into that darkness that could not be overcome. When our hope is grounded in Jesus Christ, the light of the world, it can't be shut out. And the hope for us beyond the Jews, the Israelites, is that promise, the promises of God extend beyond just God's original people. Yeah, God made those promises to the Jews and to David and to his family, but the promise extended beyond that. And we sang through the Matthew's begats and see that lineage of Jesus. And some of us might say, well, that's just a bunch of names. But when we look at it and we look at some of the people that are in that lineage, it's amazing to see who God used to be part of the line of David and the line of Jesus. And in Romans 15:12, Paul, quoting the prophet Isaiah, says this. He says, and again, Isaiah says, the root of Jesse will spring up, one who will arise to rule over the nations. In him, the Gentiles will hope. This Advent season, as we walk through the themes of Advent, hope and peace and love and joy, the question that I want all of us to consider is, how do we give that away? How do we give hope away? How do we give love away? How do we give joy away? How do we give peace away? And I think the way that we do that is being reminded that the promises of God extend beyond just the Jews, just beyond just the Israelites. And we have hope to give away. And so we extend it to other people. For the hope of Christmas to be completed and perfected, though, it should always point to the cross of Christ. And we can't think about Christmas without also considering Easter. And Easter would never have happened had Christmas not happened. And so the two need to be somewhat intertwined. Theologian Jürgen Moltmann wrote this. He said, to believe means to cross in hope and anticipation the bounds that have been penetrated by the raising of the crucified. Jesus had to be born, and if he hadn't died, he wouldn't have fulfilled the reason he was born. Jesus could have just come, and there are people who say, well, Jesus, he was a good man, he was a good teacher, and whatever. He was a lunatic if he went to the grave and went on a cross for something that wasn't really true. Why would he do something like that? And so we need to consider that the cross and the cradle are connected in that way. The hope of Jesus isn't even really something that we can fully realize, but it is something that we can anticipate. But it's also something that we don't just wait until death to begin to think about and to appreciate and enjoy. N.T. Wright, again in his book, Surprised by Hope, said, if we're not careful, we'll offer merely a hope that's no longer a surprise, no longer able to transform lives and communities. in the present, no longer generated by the resurrection of Jesus himself, and looking forward to the promised new heavens and new earth. You see, our hope is in the resurrection of Jesus Christ and our own future resurrection. That should cause us to look at this world and say, how do we give away hope? If our hope is grounded in who Jesus is, what he's done, and the fact that he beat death and resurrected from the grave, how does that change the way that we look at things? It means that when we look at this world, we shouldn't just say, hey, well, it's all going to pass away, forget about it anyway. No. It means that we look at things and say, can I be about the resurrection of things? You know, there's so many politically charged issues that we hear about, but some of them, if we take away some of the politics of them, they're serious things that we should consider as Christians. Poverty and violence and war, other things. As Christians, we shouldn't look and say, well, I've got hope beyond those things. We should say, my hope is actually firmly planted in the one who can actually change those things. Make them not as they are, but as they should be. And I appreciate N.T. Wright's words where he says this: transience acts as a God-given signpost pointing not from the material world to a non-material world, but from the world as it is to the world as it is meant one day to be. Pointing, in other words, from the present to the future that God has in store. That's how we give away hope. By pointing and telling people, yeah, this is the way things are, but this is not the way that things should be. God has promised us that one day we will experience hope because things will be as he intended them to be. And I wonder if that's where we're finding hope. Are we finding hope in the fact that what is now is not as it was meant to be? And that God's moving us towards restoration. He's moving us towards resurrection for that to happen. Our hope is found in the baby who grew up to be a man, who came into the world as it is, in order that it would one day become what it was always meant to be, what he had originally intended. That's the craning of the neck, the looking around the corner with hope and expectation of what is to come, because we know that God's promises are true. So what do we do with all this this that we've heard? We're going to keep asking ourselves these same questions throughout this series as we consider the themes of Advent. But today, where is it in our lives that we need to find hope? When we consider our lives, when we consider this time of year and the hopelessness that might feel like that darkness that's invading and trying to overtake us, where is it specifically that we need hope? And then where is it that we find it? You know, where have we been looking for hope? Have we been looking in all the wrong places for that hope? And then finally, once we find it and experience that for ourselves, hopefully grounded in the promises of Jesus and the resurrection of Jesus, how do we give that hope away? How do we say, you know what, I've been in darkness before, but I've seen this light that has come in and it's pierced this darkness, and I need to share with other people that there's something different here. How do we give that away to other people? And then, hey, I would love if we think about this and we consider this throughout Advent, share some of these stories. You know, how have I seen God bring hope into my life? And then how have I seen God use me to bring that hope to other people as well? Those are the stories that to me are far more powerful than a sermon or other things, because they're real life. They're saying, hey, this is where life and faith meet that we talk about here at the branch. This is where this collision happens. And we begin to see that God's promises, they're not just words written in a book that we pull out once a week or once a month, but they're words that mean something far more significant. And they make a difference in the lives, not just of our lives, but the lives of the people around us as well. Let me pray for us. Emmanuel, God with us. We are grateful that those aren't just words we sing or words that we read, but they are words that mean something to us. And God, we trust that during this season, you'll remind us once again where we need to put our hope. May we firmly place it in Jesus. And God, I just pray for all of us here in this space, people watching or listening as well, that God, you would remind us of your promise, that you would remind us where we need to put our hope. And that when we finally come to that place where we begin to see hope fulfilled through you, that we're not ashamed to share that with other people, to let them know that in their hopelessness there is hope beyond hope. There's hope beyond the grave. And we find that in you. And so God, bless us, I pray, in this Advent season. May we find hope anew again, in Jesus' name. Amen.
When we find our hope in the baby who grew up to be a man, Jesus Christ, our hope is firmly planted in the only one who can move the world from as it is to as it was always meant to be. Where are you putting your hope today? Thanks for listening to our podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please email us at thebranchashland@gmail.com. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, give us a review, and share with your friends and family. Thanks for listening. See you next time.